Hello and welcome to another episode of Dockside Magic. I'm your host Isaac, accompanied by my brother Aaron, yo yo yo, and my best friend Kevin.
So sorry.
We're diving into another episode after yet again a long break. These are seemingly getting fewer and further belated to each other and more spaced out, but as step up and responsibilities in life happen, people get married. Hey, it turns out it gets a lot harder to do shit like this. Hot take.
Yeah, definitely.
Who wants to kick it off on what we're chatting about today?
Well, I'd love to. So this is a little bit of a fiery, passionate topic of mine and I think a lot of people in the community, it's kind of like the elephant in the room for them. So today, actually, I think on one of our last videos, I don't know, Isaac, I think you pointed out, we had a request to kind of chat a little bit about Stax as like the main theme. There's so much to unbox there. So that's pretty much what we're gonna attempt to unravel a little bit.
No doubt. Yeah, we had a request from Jacob to talk about Stax, and here we are talking about some Stax stuff. Yeah, I think
is that Jacob Carey?
Yeah, he mentioned it just briefly in different, more over commander facets of like different types of commanders. But another gentleman, I'm trying to look through the comments here and see who I can see.
Correctly,
what's up, Jacob, fellow Cody player?
Yeah, his name is Paulie. His exact comment was, I really enjoyed this podcast. Easy sub. Can't wait to listen to more. I'd love a dedicated podcast to Stax, since this is my favorite strategy. Also, that guy sounds scary if that's his dedicated strategy, but might just me.
I think one of the original requests was how to play around Stax, and I think that the best overall quick strategy I can offer is player removal, and by that I mean literally. You just remove that person from the equation entirely.
All right, well, that's a wrap on this week's episode.
Yeah.
You have been chosen.
Yeah, right.
Awesome. Well, there'll be some key points we touch on, Stax and how it affects the meta. The different types of Stax. There's obviously a couple different genres that fall into that. The origination of Stax, like what was the card that Stax got its name from, things of that nature, and more to follow as well.
Heck yeah. No, that's all really good. I mean, actually, like I was saying, I'm super excited to chat about this stuff. I already did a good amount of research because Stax has been something that's, and many, I think, competitive players kind of feel the same way to some degree. This is a very, very passionate game that we play. Commander, you're making this baby 100 card singleton, and you want to design it to the utmost ability of what you can really put together. Stax is one of those archetypes that really just shits in your bed and then leaves it there. For some players, can leave a bad taste in the mouth, but it's also highly, highly intriguing. So I think the only Discord. Yeah, I think the only Discord that I've ever looked into that's more passionate than Stax players is probably the mono red Discord. Bunch of Godo fanatics.
Stax is like the dark arts in Harry Potter.
Yeah, but it's interesting because the other part of it too, it's not just it's not easy, right? Anywhere you go, people are always saying it's such a difficult thing to play, and yet, especially more recently, I know there was a Winota Stax list that just won. The mono white guys have made Stax really, really vibrant in terms of how feasible is it to actually be a top tier competitive strategy, using decks even like Heliod, and things of that nature, which is cool.
Right. So before we dive fully into the conversation of it, I guess maybe we could call it qualifications to talk on the matter, which I feel like I'm lacking. What are some Stax decks that you guys have built?
I'll start that off. I have built a couple. My favorite for several reasons has been Yasharn, the half man, half bear, half pig, the Selesnian beast boar. I think of a couple colors traditionally when I think of stacks. White, obviously. There are some looser stacks in green. There are some looser stacks in blue. But the green and white pairing, I tried to go for a mostly creature-based stacks list. And green has the most efficient creature tutors for that. And I found the list to be super strong and scaled well. I don't know. I really enjoyed playing its fair share of challenges, especially in its introduction to our pod. But I don't know. There's a certain level of skill that has to come with piloting stacks efficiently and well to make a game be enjoyable, because truthfully, it's all about knowing when to play what and when to not play what. You gotta know when to hold them, know when to fold them. And that deck specifically was, you could make a mistake that could, potentially alter your own game plan, but also freeze other people's game plans, just prolonging an imminent something or other that it left a certain flavor in people's mouths, to tie it back to the original point.
Sure. And Kevin, what decks?
Yeah, so I kind of dabbled with it a little bit in just even ever since I made the first blue farm list, if you guys remembered. That bitch ran Curse Totem and Draenith Magistrate because those cards are just so unbelievably good. And I obviously they still are.
You had Curse
So I've
Totem
always
in there?
kind of yeah, man. I've I've
Sarcasm.
had Curse Totem and just about fair. But so I kind of dabbled with it in most of my serious mid-range decks. I always had a little bit of oofs or a little bit of Draeniths. My first real stacks deck attempt was Magda, which was fairly recent. And a large portion of that is just because I found myself in the group of people that, I have all this passion put into my deck. I want my games to look like heavy stack interaction. Stacks games tend to turn off a lot of stack interaction and make every action a lot more critical rather than who has the most ammunition, right? So after Magda, I also made a hardcore Ow, the Dawn Sky stacks list, which I think is super fun because, well, for just reasons, but that one's been getting a little bit a popularity swing past couple of months just because it has a really cool interaction with both Nim Deathmantle and being a mono white list, you have actually a surprising amount of equipment tutors and obviously the powerhouse of stacks cards to keep the game at bay until you have the window of opportunity to really go for your win.
Nice. That's myself. I probably joined the Stax group the latest of you guys, as I had the least understanding of it and felt less competent with it. And in turn, it was a little bit slower to adapt it as an actual play style or to even integrate it at all in any of my decks. It started with the Rhystic Study, the Mystic Remoras, and started to realize it's these kind of soft stacks, mana taxing pieces are kind of viable, and started to realize that it's I might not be the type of player that wants to build a full deck around it. So I'll leave that expertise more to you gentlemen. But the deck that I've run and I've had for quite some time, I think honestly, it's probably almost been a year and a half now. Kind of hard to believe that I've been playing Kenrith that long. But Kenrith the Return King, if you're going to play stacks, you might as well play all 5 colors and be able to play any stacks you want. But it's definitely the easy intro to stacks, having more colors. Being able to play stacks in monocolors is significantly more impressive and a lot trickier. But I've literally named my deck Kenrith with a splash of stacks. It's very light in stuff that's typically very asymmetrical. That's easy for me to play around, but still cause issue for others. Just part of where I'm at in my skill level with stacks, as I'm tampering with playing around it and learning how to play it properly and effectively, without the potential risks that can come with stacks. Speaking of which, it's actually probably a good point to segue into that. You guys probably have plenty enough examples, but what are some of the realms where stacks can be almost a temperamental piece where you can it can be viewed as like a problem? Example that I'll give. Um, Sometimes when you're playing stacks, you will put something down that you think is a good value. I think it helps your game plan, and occasionally it can instantly king make. For example, like putting a uh, Lavinia down at the wrong time, not letting people be able to interact for free can really cause problems, and it can leave a really bad taste in people's mouths. Or like playing a defense grid at an impromptu time can king make for somebody. The person you pass turn to, it's like, hey, they might just use that defense grid and break it more than you would, and you gave them the win by that. So there's these level of kind of jaded feelings that can come with stacks. I mean, obviously, there's plenty more examples outside of just those.
Yeah, I think that I'll take this one here. So I think that there's quite a few different areas. That's kind of, I think it's best if we kind of break it down into different pieces rather than trying to swallow the whole pie, if you will. Because I think what you just hit on are multifacets of why Stax is such a difficult archetype. Because on one hand, it's as an introduction to Stax, you might take a look at a card, say Draenith Magistrate. This is going to be a loose example, but stand by. So you may look at a card like Draenith Magistrate and just think to yourself, this immediately needs to hit the board because the entire game plan of my strategy, and my deck wants to shut everything down. Draenith Magistrate is probably the most powerful single stacks piece, or at least in our format. And so you might think to yourself, I need to play this. So say player 1 plays that, even though there might be known information on the table, that player B, Praetor's grasped a, force of will, right? You're now shutting off that force of will because it can't be played from exile. Where many a times, actually, when you're playing stacks, you're usually not the target of counter magic. So it very well might be in the overall table's best interest to not drop it right then in that moment. That's a very loose example again, but the thing about stacks is that you're one player, and this is a big thing because it also swings not only as a negative but can actually be a positive, right? If there's multiple stacks decks at the table, typically there's not. But as the one single stacks deck, say you have 2 mid-range decks and maybe 1 turbo guy or gal, right? You have 3 opponents and 1 of yourself that's trying to shut everyone down. So what that does is essentially it casts a blank, not literally casts, but it throws a blanket of false security on the table. Oh, well, we're good. That breach deck can't win because Draenith Magistrate is out. I'm just going to keep using that because it's an easy example. Breach guy can't win, but then boom, Besaju especially really blows a hole in a lot of stack strategies, I think. But yeah, so with that said, stacks is very easy to king make because it might turn a lot of your opponents, who the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so you need these people to not die. And if their alerts are, on low alert for threat levels, then you're actually doing a disservice to the overall table and yourself in that strategy. So that's just like one difficulty. But yeah, I'm probably rambling on for too long, Aaron. What do you think?
I'm gonna ask Isaac to actually restate the question, and I want to really pay attention to the wording because I feel like this could get quite broad. Isaac, hit me with that one again.
It's mostly in the question of like, what is the primary issue that comes up with stacks? Like, what are some of the like social agreements that can feel like they're broken because of stacks? With the potential misplays it causes, or just the potential grind it causes, things like that.
I find that most of the time, I might have hinted on this a little bit before, but I find that most of the issues that arise with stacks players are just misplays, period. But the part of the beauty of that is a lot of times those plays can be very subjective. So there might be like we have this problem that's imminent problem on board, period. but we have, like, so let's say so-and-so was like, well, we didn't have to play that Stax piece because I had this and this in hand and I could have tutored for this. And I was like, could have done that. Now their whole plan is like skewed. And I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of times there's more of an emotional response to things, which leaves a certain taste in people's mouth and can affect play. And like, yes, mood is a factor, but we're all playing to win, right? It doesn't boil down to necessarily people's emotions. It boils down to trying to win. So it's difficult to play a Stax piece that affects the board state as a whole and know how that is going to fully affect the table as a whole moving into the future, and how that is going to like potentially I think that word was used earlier, king make. I feel like there's always someone that's looking at a Stax piece and they're like, oh God, this actually helps me. And then there's usually two other people that are like, oh God, this is completely shutting me down.
Yeah,
So it's like
grave detriment.
you're dividing the table in half, so to speak. And it's almost like you're making a quick alliance with somebody, and then you're making a quick, very, much like a quick two enemies.
Right, right. I think a lot of to tie on to what you're saying with the emotion that it brings is yes, Stacks is prohibitive. It's denial. You can counter somebody's thing and deny them, and typically that's well, for the most part, pretty accepted, because it's like, yep, they stopped what I had. But when you just deny them from doing what they had altogether, it brings a different level of frustration and emotion, and I think that's a lot of where the issues that people have with Stacks spur from is the, hey, it's not that I got stopped from doing what I was doing, it's that I couldn't even try to do what I wanted to do. It's like I've got a handful of gas and I can't even do any of it. Like I'm prohibited, and that's where this almost social cue, and feeling like the letdown of the lack thereof of the social dilemma or the contract that is there comes into play.
Yeah, and actually, I kind of wanted to piggyback on that too a little bit because Aaron, I think you said like misplays is the number one like issue with Stacks because it's a very technical game style or strategy. I actually would disagree with that to a small degree. Like, yes, misplays are really easy, but I think more so than that, and you guys are both saying it, but in different words. I think more so than misplays, it's lack of politicking. So as a Stacks player, it is of the utmost importance that you politic how your Stacks piece, which is prohibiting people, which has emotional ties to everyone at the table, it's your job and duty to show your opponents consistently throughout the game, maybe even every single turn cycle, why it's in their best interest to keep this Stacks piece around, until they have a win, which
Right,
that's
right.
something very difficult to do, to break through that emotion and, keep it around long enough to not king make.
Right, right. I mean, perfect example is like, say a player is clearly ahead and probably going to win on their turn. I being the player whose active turn it is, I'm like, I have a Lavinia. I want to play the Lavinia. But before I play it, it's sometimes a valuable conversation. It's like, hey, I want to play this to try to prevent this person from winning. But also at the same time, like if you voice that, it can give another player at the table the opportunity to be like, hey, that will directly shut off the free counter magic I have in my hand. It's like that conversation is very important to have. That's a different side of politicking that people kind of forget. They always think politicking is like, hey, what's in my best advantage, and occasionally politicking can actually be in those few parts where it's, hey, what's in the best advantage of all of us here so we don't lose the game. Like, yeah, if the player who's ahead win, none of us are actively getting ahead from that. What can we all do to actively be preventing this, and communicating that properly can help mitigate some of the Stacks hatred that's out there.
Yeah, that's all really good stuff. I think the other problem with Stacks decks, and maybe this is my personal opinion as well, largely because I do most of my cEDH stuff is, or at least my opinions are based around tournaments and or like time structured play, right? So I think the other real issue with Stax decks that do what I call the stacks and tax strategy is they have a really hard time winning within those time limits. Basically, in my mind, there's Winota decks and Winota slash Nagila stacks decks, and then there's the rest of them. Winota is so much more powerful than every other stack strategy, seemingly, because it has such a guaranteed win condition in the command zone. We'll get to that more later, but even still, I kind of differentiate stacks between stacks as good, tax as bad. Tax is like I kind of associate that with Thalia, Grand Arbiter, or any of the effects similar to Rhystic or Mystic Remora, like you were just mentioning. Those two pieces obviously incredible, but I'm talking about like the mono white things cost one more. When you run, all 5 or 8 or however many of those effects are out there, you run a really good chance of those being your only stacks pieces. That does absolutely nothing against a mid-range deck, which mid-range is your worst enemy, more times often than not, because they have a way to accumulate advantage over you until they just overwhelm you with answers, responses, and win attempts, and the tax effects I don't think have enough impact on the game at large as much as the real stacks effects, which is lights off. Those are cards like Lavinia, especially Rule of Law or Draenith Magistrate.
That's an interesting take.
Yes.
Where do you guys think that stacks belong?
Can you use it in a sentence? Can you be a little more
specific? Yeah, like specifically, like where do stacks belong in the sense of like, do you think EDH players should use stacks, or do you think it should be more limited to cEDH format?
I think in casual, I'll take a step. This I don't think that in casual Magic play, I would not recommend it to anyone to play stacks. I think that in casual play, stacks is really only interpreted as one direction, and that is to make enemies. And if that's your play style, like that's you, like cool, just know what you're getting yourself into. And usually people do. But I feel that stacks at its finest really only has a place in the upper echelon of cEDH, and as we've seen the meta change and shift over the years, the appropriate stacks pieces to shut down common win strategies is what keeps stacks relevant.
Right.
I would probably agree with Aaron on that. Like, as a stacks deck, we were just talking about the emotion keep in mind, cEDH is just EDH. Commander is Commander. It's just how competitive are you trying to go? Is your primary focus, in the mindset of a complete casual player, just to sit down, have a couple beers with your friends and have a good time, which there's nothing wrong with. I don't get me wrong. I think I speak for all three of us. We love casual Commander, but I would never dare bring a stacks deck to a table, even though of our group, I'm probably most that guy to do so. Usually with a bunch of quirky casual storm decks. But yeah, I don't think stacks decks really have a place all that much, or at least as much in casual Commander, not only because it'll make your friends really, really salty, and it might kind of diminish the amount of fun, whereas in cEDH, it adds a layer of fun many a times, where it's like kind of like at moving a chessboard around, where you just have a really interesting puzzle to solve. I was thinking of the chess term. It's a puzzle, right. But yeah.
And somewhat to touch on, I think where it can cause detriment to the game and enjoyment in the game for the more casual level of EDH is that you touched on it, Kevin, actually. It can make games go very long. You're going to your local game shop to play Magic, and you sit down at a pod, and somebody whips out a stacks deck, and it takes, a game that might have been an hour long, and it makes it 3 hours, and you lose that game. It's like, well, that's your whole night. And you didn't get to play another game. You didn't get a chance to win another game because one game took a very, very long time. And I think that's the biggest issue at hand that spurs the problems that people have with stacks. It causes, like, even in competitive play, it causes this weird distribution of points when it's like, well, that whole table got a tie because stacks. And then you get to this spot to where you go to turns where everybody gets their last turn after the time is up. And it's like the slowest play you'll ever see because now the time is stopped. And it's like, hey, if you don't win on your turn, you're not going to win. So like you get, most tournaments are 90 minutes, right? But if you end up going
75
to turns,
now.
75, yeah. So if you end up going to turns, each person, all players get a turn. All right, they get one additional turn. Those turns probably average 15 minutes apiece. Each, not the turn cycle, I'm talking their each individual turn. That's taking a 90-minute game or a 75-minute game and tacking on an extra hour. Then the rest of the tournament is waiting on you. And that's some of also the issue at hand that can arise. Now, like, I will wholly agree with you. I don't think Stax belongs in casual EDH. I think it strictly belongs in competitive EDH because there's the understanding of, hey, I'm going to do anything possible I can to win this game that's legal, and they're going to do anything they can to win the game and stop me from winning the game.
Oh, absolutely. And then just like one last thing to dovetail off that, and then we'll move on to the next part here. But I definitely don't think, excuse me, I don't think Stax would even be good in casual. Because like, what is a Stax deck that stops a bunch of, mind you, Stax decks in order to be successful, have to do one thing, which is anticipate what the meta at that table will look like, and then fill their deck with slots that will handle those things and turn them off appropriately. And in casual tables, people are just dropping 10 tens like no big deal. The turns go 3 to 4 turns, typically longer, really not that much longer than your average cEDH game. But the difference is it's much more heavy on the punch and heavy on the creatures, which Stax decks typically associate themselves with, so they don't want to turn off creatures as much. So
Right. So
yeah.
I want to dive into this really quick too. Obviously, we've chatted a ton about the different stacks and what Stax is, but let's dive into fast the actual kind of almost genres of stacks. So the ones that I've mapped out in my head, just thinking of it offhand, is like spell casting denial. So like rule of law, you can only cast one spell a turn. Like silence.
You wanna give Stax like a quick definition, or at least like our subjective version of what that looks like?
For sure, yeah. It's probably something that's beneficial to do even earlier on than this point.
That's cool. That's cool.
Here, and fire away with the definition, at least what you think of Stax.
Yeah, let me take a stab here. So when I think of Stax, I think of any kind of way that you engineer a deck to be able to decelerate key portions of the game, whether that be targeting lands, whether that be slowing the rate of spells that are able to be cast per turn. It doesn't matter. I think that the overall best way to describe it is trying to control the game by decelerating key points of the game and targeting that specifically.
Right. So yeah, jumping back to the different types then, now that we have a definition, thank you. Spellcasting denial, card draw denial, so limitation of how many cards you can draw, limitation of how many spells you can cast, and mana denial, whether that be taxing effects, like, hey, Mystic Remora, are you going to pay the 4? Rhystic Study, you got to pay the 1. Thalia effects, you have to pay 2 extra colorless. Or even like Collector Roof, hey, I'm turning off your stuff. Or even, Back to Basics, Magnus of the Moon, Blood Moon. I think those all fall under the mana denial. There's definitely, I think, other categories that I'm missing, like the preventative stuff, like maybe even like ETBs, like your Hushbringer, Dress Down. There's a lot of those effects that prevent something from actually triggering, so preventative of trigger abilities. There's a lot of different types of stacks, but I think those 3, maybe 4, we'll call it, are the general subcategories or genres of it that you're going to find out there.
Hold on, I got to throw one more in there. I think this one is the most slept on category, and here's my hot take of the episode. It's graveyard stacks. Rest in peace. Dalthy
So good.
Voidwalker.
Bajuka Bug.
Oof.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bajuka Bog, yeah.
I mean, that's where, to your point, where Draenith Magistrate being one of the most powerful pieces of stacks out there, is it prevents people from actually casting stuff. It prevents people from doing stuff from their graveyard.
It doesn't
Punishing
stop a
graveyard
Hulk.
is huge.
Mhm.
Yeah, punishing graveyard right now is still very relevant. It's always been like this, like small glimmer of a light of relevance, but it's never like lost its glimmer of light. Like it's always been there. It's always been relevant. It may not be the most like pertinent strategy or commonly seen strategy out there, but it's always still just a little bit there, and it gets overlooked. Like how many decks right now run Rest in Peace?
Not nearly as
That,
many
that's the
as
thing.
should.
I'll add this. How many, as a very proactive player, how many proactive lists have you seen where it's just threat, gas, and you're like, there's a Draenith in here? Like, what? Why is there a Draenith Magistrate in here? There are just, frankly, there's some cards that just offer such a resilient level of power that it is difficult to not include regardless of your strategy.
I'd say I'd limit those to Dalthy Voidwalker, Draenith Magistrate, and for myself, maybe it's more of a pet card, but I think for most people, actually, definitely Opposition Agent as well, because Search or like Suppression Field, Leon and Arbiter, any tutor denial, I think is also a massive punch in the gut, man. I mean, just looking through the overall cEDH decklist database, the number of tutors that are ran in each deck on average is ridiculously high. You know, the odds of
Right.
you just drawing the nuts are pretty low, since in our format, as opposed to, you know, more standard 60 card formats, we don't run cantrip. There's no way that we're going to dig through 100 cards or, you know, 93 cards, whatever, and find what we need to find, because we also don't have the redundancy. So our answer to that issue, you know, from a base monologue is just tutors, since we have so many phenomenal versions of that. So I think that's another way that it can get really hosed. But I kind of want to transition this, like while we're talking about different stacks archetypes, and you know, take it back if need be. But what came to my mind when you, Isaac, you were kind of going through all of those, is Blood Pod. I think Blood Pod is probably like, if not the, at least one of the most iconic Stax decks in our format. And I think, like, while we're talking about different categories, and really hopefully it brings some insight to everyone, like, I think at the end of the day, like the bottom line with Blood Pod, it says it even right there in the primer, like the first paragraph, like, look, this is just a blind meta version of this deck. You absolutely need to take what this deck has and acclimate it to your meta. So what that means is, if you're seeing more graveyard strategies, if you're playing against, you know, you're seeing graveyard strategies, obviously you play more Rest in Peace effects. If you're playing against, say, Kirk, well, what do we know about Kirk? It's a mono black, you know, storm
Gas.
deck that just goes gas, right? But because it's mono black, it relies so incredibly heavily on its tutor package and high density, since it can pay 2 life and 2 mana, or 4 life, 2 mana for a whatever that tutor is.
Right, like have a Yasharn at a Kirk table. How's the Kirk to do?
Right. So maybe Aven Mind Sensor is going to be the correct meta call, whereas Aven Mind Sensor may very well may not be the best meta call if you're playing against, you know, more mono blue decks or and what have yous.
And you're saying Aben Mind Sensor in addition to Opposition Agent.
Oh, but of course.
Yeah, it's like strictly color dependent, but if your colors can run both, you better be running Opposition first, then Aven.
Yeah. And trust me, speaking as a primary Hulk player, I hate those cards. It's like the amount of times where you actually get just barrel stuffed by one of those two is pretty few, but when it happens, man, you're just very reminded that they
It's
exist.
not easy to forget. It's not easy to forget.
Yeah. But
what
I don't know.
so like meta wise, obviously Stax is very prevalent, being, you know, we came off this very turbo meta and now we're bigger into this mid-range meta, and Stax did a good job of stopping turbo. and it does a good job of still playing against mid range. I think that's its main competitors mid range. But like, what are some of the main decks you guys are seeing out there that are like the predominant, successful, and capable Stax decks?
Fighting against Stax or using
No.
Stax?
Using Stax.
Oh, I see. Ah, man, I do bring it back to Heliod often. It's a tried and true deck that is, I don't know, I guess we've all seen it 1,000 times. I don't think it's like particularly hot or like big topics of conversation, but I do see that deck actually pop up somewhat frequently, and it'll still make an appearance in like snag a top 10 in some big tournaments. So it's always a kind of a sleeper, and I enjoy the flavor of that one.
Yeah. Heliod's one of the main ones that I think of too, especially in relevance of actual quality. I think like the original one that I think of, and this is obviously strictly dependent on when I really kind of started getting into cEDH and paying attention, was Grand Arbiter. That was kind of like the OGest that I know of. I know there's ones that are more soonerly happened. The Grand
King
Arbiter
Brago.
was, yeah, Brago Stax. That was around the same time as Grand Arbiter. Same thing with like Lavinia. All those, was it Esper? Those Esper decks. Am I right? Those were really, really relevant in their day and were an absolute menace in the format. And it's like, imagine stepping into a pod, having not seen like a Stax heavy deck ever, and getting Stax like that, and how like earth shattering that would have been. Like, oh, that's a thing. Like people are doing that now. Holy cow! Like, how do I adapt against that? It's like, oh, well, let's get faster than that. Like let's turbo past that.
I will say too, I've seen a good bit of Ishai paired with whatever lately as well. I think part of the draw of Ishai is the inclusion of white into somebody else's partner pairing that allows them to dip a little further into stacks. But the Ishai also, I mean, there's a little flavor there with being able to have someone of a win con and pressure life totals, which when it boils down to it, sometimes stacks is what it comes down to, is pressuring life totals and creature beats, which I mean is kind of cool.
Right. I'm actually curious, Kevin and Aaron, like what's like when you think of Stax and cEDH of current, like what's the card that comes to your mind instantly? Like
Winota.
Let me show you what I think it's gonna end up being. I'm super high on this card. Wrath.
Okay.
The Weatherlight Stalwart. I don't know if you guys have really looked into this so much, but it has just some fantastic potential with having.
Give her a read.
Sure, let's load it up. Wrath, Weatherlight Stalwart. It's a white and a blue legendary creature human wizard. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control. If you do, draw a card. It also has an ability. You can pay 3 colorless and 2 white. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. So the reason why I like this card so much is it allows you to play Stax control. You can pack your deck full of, the Path to Exile, rapid hybridization packages. You can also have just cantrippy type effects like Brainstorms or Git Probe or whatever you want to do. And it also allows, depending on what strategy you lean into, which I'm personally pretty high on the Isochron Scepter with a Dramatic Reversal. Dramatic Scepter, you've got your win con on the card as well, which I think is super cool. It also allows you, even if you don't have access to that amount of mana being unlimited, you can dump 5 mana into it, pump all your creatures, which are usually more your stacks pieces, and add an extra 5 damage or whatever it might be to your attack on pressuring somebody's life total, and all of your creatures have vigilance, which allows you to not be the target of attacks. I think it's really good, and I'm not even gonna discount the fact that it's a 1 power 3 toughness. The 3 toughness becomes weirdly relevant sometimes as well. Like it's resilient.
It blocks Timna.
Yes, it can. It's resilient. it is easy to play again. If something happens to it, you have your win con and you have a draw engine on the same card. I'm all about it. It's done. I'm all about it.
So you guys both listed commanders. So Kevin saying Winota, absolutely a menace in the format currently. For me, when I think of Stax and meta, I think of Rule of Law. And obviously that's an effect style. Obviously that's a card name, but there's several cards that are still Rule of Law cards. There's multiple of that have pretty much the same exact text, just a different type of card. Rule of Law really, really punishes right now. It's still very, very tricky to play around, and is a hard stop on a lot of people. Oh yeah.
So
it's a hard stop for a lot of
that's where I'm actually going to disagree a little bit. Not entirely, because Rule of Law is an absolute game warping card. I definitely don't argue that. What I will say though is I think that Rule of Law has been very prevalent in the overall cEDH metagame for long enough to where the majority of, maybe not majority, that might be dangerous to say, but a large amount of people have really begun to find out I can just play around this regardless of what my deck strategy is, right?
I think
specifically
you seriously overestimate most cEDH players.
All right, yeah. Well, fair fair enough. But like, and again, a lot of my opinions are based off of, tournament play and stuff like that. But let me paint a couple of different scenarios, right? So Thrasios, especially the mid-range king, right? Let's paint a scenario in which you activate Thrasios, you scry 1, you see a, I don't know, Thassa's Oracle or Laboratory Maniac. You obviously scry that to the bottom, and then on the end step, in which there's a Rule of Law in play already, where other opponents have already cast their one spell for turn, you just cast your Demonic Consultation or your Tainted Pact or your whatever it is, and just name Thassa's Oracle Labman, and then you have that known information. Another scenario, the classic tried and true Tainted Pact end step.
The Tainted Pact end step I think is often forgot about.
But not only that, but mid-range decks are playing. There's the white creature. I know Sick Robot has been playing, where if you don't run any other white cards, you can essentially exile your library right on the spots. The name of the card is escaping me. I personally don't like that one as much, but there's that. There's Protein Hulk. There's Magda. There's Alf. There's decks that don't necessarily rely as heavily on needing to cast 2 spells in the same turn.
Right. So in lieu of that, then what are some of the cards out there that are like the most slept on Stax pieces that are very effective, potentially easy to play and underplayed?
I'm going to go ahead and put in my 2 cents. Now, this is where I think it comes down to some more personal preference, but cards like the orbs, say like Winter Orb,
Static.
and the, Winter Orb, Static Orb, and I'll throw in Tangle Wire. Cards that are mandatory that you tap X amount of permanents or only X amount of permanents can untap, I think adds a very fair dynamic that, yes, can be targeted at a player that has a certain, acceleration, but I think they're a very fair dynamic that allows for a very predictable outcome because of the fact that they have the same effect roughly on every single player. You say like Tangle Wire even, like what is going to happen with the fading counters at X turn. You know what I mean? There's like it's not an impending doom. It's like this is the way that the board is going to be played for this amount of time. And I think that is just brilliant play because you can engineer your play and your deck, but engineer your play to be able to work around that and soak in other people. But everybody knows that,
Cool. What commander breaks parity on that best right now?
Oof. Man, I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to think on that one for a second, probably.
I'm guessing Urza. I think Urza can get around the orbs well.
There's Urza and also the new one from Dominaria, the Gruul one.
Oh yeah, the Gruul commander's kind of wild.
It's Gruul Urza. I don't like it as much, but
I might even say like the Seedborn Muse builds where you're basically Neoform or Eldritching, usually like your Bruce Tarl into Seedborn. I've seen some Stax lists where you basically get into Seedborn, and at the end of your last opponent's turn, before your turn, you don't tap all your stuff and sink it into Thrasios or whatever. You just leave it all untapped, and you have open resources to use for your turn.
Right.
Kind of cool.
Kevin, what do you think card wise?
I have two. So first off, I have the Hushbringer effects that turn off the enter the battlefield
ETB
abilities. Not only does that immediately stop a Thassa's Oracle, whammy, but also the real Goblin Bastard Dockside Extortionist is just no longer really a real threat. And then also there's just so many different ETB effects out there. It's incredible. One day I went through and just like looked at all the things that a Hushbringer or Hushwing Griff, whatever, really shut off. So I think that's one of two. Two of two, I think, are cards like, and what I'm using the scale here is like, what do I see that has the most impact on a game where it's just like backbreaking? I think they're cards like Linvala or Suppression Field, where activated abilities of creatures, especially, I know we were talking recently on one of our other episodes where it's like it's such a creature heavy meta right now, where a lot of people are trying to do the mid-range thing, use creatures. And so when you have the ability, especially in Linvala, that's just disgusting, to only affect your opponents. I think those are probably the most two underplayed. Suppression Field specifically, in terms of being underplayed.
Yeah. I think underplayed, easy to play, and easy to break parity on. They're not necessarily asymmetrical, but you can build your deck around it to be asymmetrical to these. Is your Null Rod and Collect Roof effects, as well as your Curse Totem effects. I think those things that actively turn stuff off are really, really, really underplayed.
Dude, Karn the Great Creator, holy crap.
Right. Like
Pretty
if you're
good.
able to take your Curse Totem, and build a deck around it to where it's not punishing you and play that card, I can guarantee in the meta currently, you're going to cause problems for other people that they're going to have a hard time getting around.
So what's an example of a commander like that?
Sorry, Aaron. Your boy Kinnan. Any of your elf strategies massively, like if you see somebody with a mono green deck across from you, it turns out Curse Totem's going to be pretty good. Creatures are, creature abilities are heavily being used right now. It turns off Thrasios. Like, it's strong. It's really strong. But I think the Collector Roof Null Rod are more often a safe bet, but harder to be asymmetrical on. I think it's harder to build a deck around shutting your own artifacts off, because in cEDH, no matter what, it's still hard to not use fast mana. In certain decks, it's still hard to not use a Mana Crypt or a Soul Ring. And you can also kind of inadvertently stacks yourself out, so it's a little bit harder to build around, I think, but still easy enough. For example, like I play the Kenrith deck with a Splash O Stax, and in that deck, I don't run Curse Totem. I don't run Null Rod, but I do run Collector Roof, and the Collector Roof can easily shut me out of the game when I'm trying to do Phantasmal Image Dockside stuff. But it's still often or not just way more powerful than that, and what it's doing, yes, it's shutting me down a little bit on that, but it's shutting 3 other people down almost guaranteed that are trying to use artifacts. Almost every single time there's going to be somebody that's trying to break artifacts open. For example, I play a Malcolm Kedis deck where it's just Treasure Storm. Like, well, yeah, Null Rod and Collector Roof decimate that deck. It's very hard for me to win through that. The only way I can is if I mount a bunch of artifacts and get Magda out. That's really the only way I can. It's still a very powerful effect that I think is underplayed, somewhat slept on, and very much so underutilized, because those are what I describe as the easy stacks to play. I'll reiterate to that, a lot on every episode is easy stuff is usually the realm which I abide by, because I wouldn't consider myself a very intricate or high intelligence player. I like to do simple things with big effects, and that's where I rank, your Null Rod, Collector Roof, Cursed Totem effects.
Yeah, but you know who you sound like when you say that? You sound like Ken Bowerman, who just won Tier 1 Con and walked away with a time twister on his Kraken Sakashima. And so, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the KISS method, right? Keep it simple, stupid.
Let's also not forget about the Stony Silence in this mix, too. It's a little,
yeah.
Little
Stony Silence is a good one because it gives you your Rule of Law effect, but it's still more possible to play around on your turn.
Stony Silence is just a Collector Roof and enchantment.
It's an enchantment Collector Roof, yeah.
Oh, I'm just mixing up cards then. That's cool.
That's cool.
I'm
thinking Deafening Silence. That's the one I'm thinking.
Yeah,
about.
You're thinking of Deafening. That card does work as well, for sure.
Yeah.
Personally, I think because I was mostly focusing on like what's underplayed. I think like looking forward into the future, being as how Stax is a piece of, everything, right? It's not uncommon to see Stax pieces. Even though I'd say it's probably uncommon to see devoted Stax decks. I think that's what's being mostly gone about in people's deck brewing is, okay, Draenith Magistrate is incredibly powerful. Collector Oof falls into that incredibly powerful. Opposition Agent falls into that incredibly powerful. I think if they print more effects like Opposition Agent and even Mind Sensor, I kind of touched on that earlier, but I think that is what would really just completely bust open Stax altogether as a strategy.
Right. I mean, this is completely side tangent, but like, look at the power of Dothy Voidwalker. It's almost so freaking good that I almost don't want to play it because it causes this, like, every gun at the table's pointed at my head. It's like, it's so good, I almost don't want to play it. I do. Make no mistake, I do. But as soon as it hits the battlefield, it's like, I'm priority number 1 for the Claw to take out of the game. And everybody's now fighting over the Dothy with, like, Gilded Drakes.
Oh, I was going to say, I literally took Dothy Voidwalker out of my Razakats build because everyone took it with Gilded Drake, and then I couldn't entomb a Razakath anymore. And it was just like, so frustrating. Cards like that are just nuts. But then at the same time, flip the tables and look at the turbo lists. Cards like Ad Nauseam are pretty frustrating too, aren't they? Hey. So, and by the way, I think it definitely needs to be mentioned. We were talking a lot about it earlier. I think all three of us kind of said that, like, we think the Achilles heel to Stax decks are mid-range lists because they deploy their value engines and just get so far above everyone else that they're just winning. They're in a winning position.
They can grind past the Stax player with better value pieces.
Exactly. It can't go left unsaid that turns 1 through 3, you have to survive. You have to rely on those control players, which kind of intrigues me, Aaron, about your Wrath list that you're putting together. Being a mix of control and Stax.
Yeah, dude, I'm really enjoying the challenge of engineering this deck. Frankly, the deck casts a shit ton of spells. Like, it casts a whole bunch of them, and it doesn't really matter if I'm currently not running Rule of Law effects in my deck. But this deck can play against Stax decks super well, because I can cast a bunch of instants. I have so many instants in this deck. I can cast, screw it, 1 per turn on everybody else's turn while I'm incurring value and, getting card draw from that. It's a fun little mixture, and that ratio I have not perfected yet, but I'm definitely questing to do exactly that.
Yeah, I think that's super sick. I'll definitely kind of throw a little mini plug in here for Popophobia over at there's a newer podcast, not super new, but some super cool guys. They just sponsored the most recent Chaos tournaments, called Sadnaz. He made a really interesting Stax list that I think is pretty sick. He's got Search and Destroy, which is Armix and Timna with a Stax shell, winning through Abdel. I think decks like that, because really personally my least favorite thing, and I guess we're just gonna go right into it. My least favorite thing about Stax decks is when the commander does something exactly like Lavinia or like Yasharn, right? Where they do something immensely impactful and they shut down a ton of shit and get you nowhere closer to your win condition. I think, and that's why on the retrospect of that, or in, the flip side of that, why like my top 2 Stax lists out there include Winota and Najila, is because the win condition is already built in. So I think like if you're looking into building a Stax list, another one I've seen it's super cool, and some people build it Stax, others more Storm, but what's the green white one? The Enchantress.
Sithis?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, Sithis. I think that's another really, really cool one, where like you're gonna have a much easier time. Your mulligans will get much simpler if you have to just focus on deploying a value engine that is at the same time helping you shut other people down.
What about Kenrith stacks?
Yeah, Kenneth is of course going to be good no matter what you do with it. Yeah, but Najila specifically is a win condition in the command zone. You throw together a hardcore 5-color Stax deck plus Derevi. Like that's pretty good.
I've got kind of an interesting question if we're starting to kind of wind this like up. I'm not sure what other points we have to talk about, but maybe we can make this quick. But if just brainstorming, if you had to make some kind of Stax piece, you had the opportunity to engineer a Stax piece to introduce to the game, what would it do? I will go first and say, if I could introduce a Stax piece, it would be an artifact that had no activated abilities, be like a 3 CMC. And it would say something along the lines of, anytime a player activates an ability of an artifact, that player loses 1 life. And there'd be some other like just static ability that went on with that. But I think that would see play. I think that it would help pressure life totals no matter what deck you're running. Usually you have artifacts in it, but I also think that it would help put a damper on the immense amount of Storm lists that we see that are including treasure accumulation, and win lines with usually dockside. I also think that it would reduce the amount of like dramatic scepter wins that we see. I just think that it would be really, I don't know. I think it's just a curious play. Any further ideas on like what Stax pieces you think could help formulate or push the meta into another light?
I think more stacks, and this isn't like a new style, but more of just activated ability stacks, or even triggered ability stacks.
Yeah, that's tough. I think really what's going to bust open Stax, and this is probably why, like, throughout the whole time of us talking, we've mentioned so many different commanders. I think it's pretty well agreed upon that Temna Plus is going to be your best, quote unquote, air quotes, best cEDH commanders, right? It doesn't particularly mean that for Stax it's the best strategy, but I think Stax is much more undiscovered in that if there's a new commander, like specifically a legendary creature, like Winota with me, let's say another color or two, I think that is going to just shatter. Like imagine if Winota had black. Oof.
Mardu Winota. Um, what? Who? I got this is a funny question. Who do you think wears the pants in the relationship? Timna or Thrasios?
That entirely depends on who else is in the room. Read the room, John.
Yeah, I think it's unquestioned Thrasios.
Really?
Oh no, it's
See,
Timna.
that's where-
Timna
that's
is the most
where-
powerful card in cEDH. Change my mind. I'll be here all night. Thrasios can be better in certain settings, but Timna gives you 3 cards for free after the turn in which he's deployed. Thrasios you need to play into quite a bit more.
I think I'll agree with Kevin. You've got Timna Thrasios. Thrasios may be like the head of the house, but like Timna's the neck of the house that can turn the head wherever it wants.
Yeah, mind you guys, we're not even talking about Crom anymore because Stax really like hurts the blue farm types. Like one thing that I definitely, because I feel like we've talked a lot negatively on Stax, but like I think those are much more so not negative points, but just warnings in what you should not do, right? Stacks overall are sweet. Let's not even kid. Like you're sitting there on the table with your like rule of law, or let's say even deafening silence. Isaac, I've seen you with your Kenrith list. Deafening silence, collector oof, and like Draenith magistrate, and you're just sitting there like, I don't give a crap what's happening because y'all can't do shit.
Right. All right, what would you rather have? Would you rather lose the game to a turn to Turbo Adnaz, or would you rather lose the game to Stax on turn 10?
Turbo Adnaz.
Every time, right?
I'm actually going to probably say the turn
No, you're
10
not.
Stax. No, hear me out.
No
Depending
way.
on what deck I'm playing, right? Because if I'm playing like a mid-range deck, there's a pretty good chance there's a lot of fighting back and forth.
Okay.
But if I'm playing more of a turbo deck myself, or like say Cody, right, the arch nemesis of cEDH, then I'm playing a butt ton of interaction, and like there's a good chance that we might just have a lot of stack interaction. So I don't know. Hard one to answer.
Interesting question. What else we got, fellas?
Well, I think that about wraps it up, right? Like we've talked about why it's so hard to play, the misplays, different types of stacks, how to play against it. Have we touched much on that? How do you play against stacks? Just real quick.
I don't know if that's a real quick, but we could try.
Maybe give a card then that does well against playing against a fairly universal amount of stacks. I'll go March of Swirling Mists. It's a good answer to stacks right now.
Can I also, in that same light, and I've started including this in some of my rough draft lists, in that same light, Curse of the Swine. I love that card. It's at sorcery speed, but the opportunity to exile a bunch of creatures for an extra mana of whatever is pretty good. You guys familiar with the card?
Did you say Winds of Abandon?
I think the Hinata list played this, doesn't it? It has X.
I'm not sure if that.
You're talking about the white Kawagama equivalent to March?
No. It's X and blue, and it says exile X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller puts a 2/2 green boar creature token onto the battlefield.
It's
that's a Theros, like a real old Theros.
Yeah,
card.
the Hinata list where it's like it costs 1 less for each additional target.
Does it have pigs on the picture?
Yeah, that played that.
Yeah.
Curse of the Swine is pretty good.
That's definitely interesting. I'm gonna go a little bit wider than a single card, but the whole channeling ability plus anything that doesn't use the stack. So what I mean by that are like triggered abilities mainly, because activated abilities can be turned off. Triggered abilities can't really be turned off by anyone other than like a very, very devout,
not efficiently,
maybe like Niv Mizzet deck that's playing like I don't know, Stifle or whatever. So anything that's not using the stack, like a Boseiju, obviously Adawara has done incredible things for me, Adawara especially, and Beseju, right? And those both work around the rule of law. They're pseudo uncounterable. And the same thing goes for, like, I've been having a lot of success, honestly, with the Protein Hulk lines because they're just more difficult to interact with.
You know, the Otawara and the Beseju are relevant when you haven't played a land for turn and you have one of those in hand and you opt not to play a land for turn, being that card, and you want to just hold it up. That's how you know it's very, very relevant.
Agree. See, I don't know, man. I'm kind of crazy. If I've got turn 1 Birds of Paradise and my only land in hand is Beseju, and for some reason I keep it, I'm playing the Beseju's land for turn. Like 9 out of 10 times,
I
I'll
guess
play them as my
I'm
lands.
definitely referring to later game, like where you're able to go,
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
I don't need the value of a land. I want to just sandbag this land. That's more of what I'm getting at. But like often or not, like you get to 3 lands, you might actually consider, you've already have 3 lands out. You might consider sandbagging your Beseju. You're like, I might be able to live without the value of that extra land right now at the cost of being the potential to shut off somebody's thing.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah,
And then,
as aforementioned, there are so few things that can stop that channel ability, like almost nothing.
dude, a lot of people hate the channel ability, or at least people I've talked to about
Get
it.
out of here! No way.
I think it's sick. I think that's brilliant card design. I loved it.
Too. They're like very fair casting costs. The stipulations from them are just, I don't know.
I mean, in the decks I've put them in, I've taken a spell out for them, not a land. Say I was running 28 lands, I'm now running 29. Like no lands came out. I took a spell out. I took interaction or something like that, or a low value card out instead. And I consider those as interaction, not lands usually. But that's just of my bias. It's not that that's the correct answer.
So I think one other point to bring up while we're talking about like how to play against Stax is how can you position. I think, well, more than just positioning, I think it really boils down to understanding your own deck. Because in a stacked out board, you have to be able to find your line. Even if it's like 7 specific cards, you got to know what's your out. And if it's not an out, what will you do if another player begins to present a break to the lock?
Right. Interesting. I think for the most part that wraps it up, unless you guys have other stuff you want to touch on. We've hit a lot of topics reaching all over the tree here. Is there anything else we need mentioned that's still very pertinent to the conversation? I've got something, but I'm opening it up to you guys. See what you got.
What you got, Isaac?
Cool. Who am I going to single out? Kevin, I'm singling you out. Your high, low, Buffalo. High of the day, low of the day, and Buffalo is just something random. Of 0 importance, just something random that was cool. Not related to Magic, just life. What you got?
High, low, Buffalo.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Ooh.
So I'm gonna start. I'm gonna definitely start with Buffalo because I'm staring at them this entire podcast. We finally got down to
You're
cleaning
staring at Buffalo.
Nah, I'm staring at my turtles, dude.
Oh.
We finally got around to cleaning the turtle tanks today, and they were just disgustingly filthy. And now these dudes are just nose diving like there's no tomorrow, and it's sick to watch. Highs and lows. Highs and lows probably got the clear to close on the. I do mortgages, so that's always exciting when we get full approval from underwriting for someone you've been working with for a couple months. Lows probably leaving
the economy.
Yeah, the same breath of air. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Cool. Well, that wraps it up. Ran over Stax, the ins and outs, what it does in the meta, how people play around it, different card types, commanders, what it can benefit, what it can cause, the ins and outs essentially, which I think was a profitable conversation. I feel like I actually was able to take something away from it. I hope everybody else that's listening in that's still here can also have taken something from it, because truly I wholeheartedly believe that Stax belongs in cEDH. I think it's a completely irrelevant piece to use. I just think you have to
Yeah.
still be able to have a solidified, plausible win line through it, and your game plan isn't just getting people to tap out and forfeit. I don't think that's a plausible way of playing Stax. Maybe that's me speaking jadedly. I don't know, but I think you still need to have an actual win con in your deck, not just a con.
Well, there's also not to be that guy, but there's also like the Timna Kamal variations of Stacks where their win con is just straight beats, where the
But
beats get
that's
they get big quick.
yeah. Without going too far into it, I think that's very
Eilish
relevant.
Norn, oof.
Yeah, I think Kamal is actually oddly relevant. That's a good deck.
Agree.
All right, signing off, gentlemen. Appreciate you for
Leave
hopping
us
on.
oh, you bet. And to those listening, definitely leave us another comment below. Definitely always excited to read through what people's thoughts are as we're kind of stirring the pot, having these conversations amongst ourselves. Everyone's own opinions on the matter. The fact is with cEDH, like we just don't have enough time to play the game or different groups to play the game with. So I'd be really curious to see, where people disagree, agree, and or what they'd like to hear next.
Right? Yeah. What you guys want to hear next is the the big one. Make it easy for us to come up with content, because right now talking about it's easy. Coming up with the content is harder, and figuring out the time to talk about it is even harder. All right, gentlemen. Appreciate your time. I'm going to bed.